Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center, those of you who are here and those who are joining us on our webcast this morning. I expect a big turnout on our webcast as well as those of you here. I'm Bill Hoagland, a Senior Vice President here with the Bipartisan Policy Center. I've had the pleasure over the last many years here to work with our health team on a number of the issues that we have been addressing in the health venue. We are dubbing this week here at BPC Health Week because besides this event today focusing on drug patents, yesterday we had a public event focusing on the barriers providing primary care in the Medicaid program, and tomorrow we will be discussing with an expert group including representatives from the White House and HHS the Stark and anti-kickback laws. And while I'm at it, a little bit of a heads up, and looking ahead to 2020, I want to give an early notice, as I did yesterday, on one very important event we will be having. On February the 5th, we will be releasing recommendations from our over 2 years bipartisan Future of Health work, co-chaired by former Senators Tom Daschle and my last boss on the Hill, Senator Frist, along with former Acting Director CMS Andy Slavitt and former Director Gail Walensky. Dr. Ulrich Roy, who will be moderating one of our panels here this morning, is a member of that Future of Health group, and he has devoted not only his time but his intellect to developing some very important final recommendations. So you'll not want to miss that event coming up during what is clearly going to be a very tumultuous election year with health care at the top of the agenda. Today, however, we are discussing patent approval process as it relates to the pharmaceutical industry. It seems clear to me, and I presume the experts here, that pharmaceutical patents and market exclusivity can incentivize innovation in the United States to the benefit of millions of Americans suffering from debilitating diseases. But it's also possible that some patent practices can impact the affordability of brand drugs and biologics, and therefore, again, patent patients' access to those critical modifications. According to a study by the firm Equiva, since 2016, FDA has approved 2,492 generic versions of 617 patent brand name drugs. But less than 2/3 of generic drugs approved over this period were launched into the market. I think, and we'll hear from the panelists, there are probably understandable reasons why an FDA-approved generic never comes to market. There are changes in business practices. There are production line issues. There's drug makers' consolidations. But it is also asserted that brand name drug makers have used legal defenses in the patent process to keep generics off the market. To help us understand this process and its likely impact on pharmaceutical market competition, we are extremely fortunate to have two of the very top-level government officials with us this morning to discuss this. United States Patent Trademark Office Commissioner Drew Hirschfield and Marcus Meyer, I believe I pronounced that correct, Meyer, the Assistant Director for Healthcare at FTC. They will be joined by Dr. Ulrich Roy, President for the Foundation of Research and Equal Opportunity, and as I said earlier, a major contributor to BP's Future of Healthcare project that I've already mentioned. Ulrich will moderate that discussion, and then following their discussion, you'll have an opportunity for questions for them. But a second panel on drug patent experts will provide insights into this issue, moderated by BPC's Chief Medical Advisor, Anand Parakh. So, gentlemen, please join the stage, and Ulrich, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bill, and it's great to be here. I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for putting this on. I find that the more complex the issue, the more likely there is to be maybe mischief that affects patients, consumers, taxpayers. And also, it's something that often, because it's so complex, doesn't get covered by the press and has a lot of policy importance. And this issue of intellectual property innovation and pharmaceuticals is clearly an example that maybe, Drew, why don't we start with you? Can you explain, so we often talk about, or we sometimes talk about, how the Constitution talks about the importance of patents. And of course, there are statutes that relate to and inform the constitutional instruction. What are your statutory and constitutional instructions as an officer of the USPTO?
Sure. Be happy to. First, let me just thank BPC for not only having me here today, but for doing this event. Drug pricing and access to drugs is critically important, and I really applaud you for having the conversation. I also appreciate the remarks so far about the complexities, because I do feel very strongly that this is a very complex issue and we need to get down to a fact-based conversation. So I applaud BPC for having the event. So turning to your question, let me start with the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution does provide for an exclusive right to innovators in return for disclosing their invention. That is something that should not be taken lightly. I know it is obviously the Constitution, but as you heard in some of the remarks earlier, in my opinion, the idea of having incentives for innovation is absolutely critical. And as we talk about drug pricing and access to drugs, I do think we need to make sure as a country we're providing the right incentives to our innovators so they're continuing to bring drugs to the marketplace. And I know I'm speaking in the context of drugs, but that actually applies all the way across the patent system. And turning to the statutes, we have a number of statutes, patent statutes, that every examiner is trained on, every patent examiner that is trained on from day one when they walk into the PTO. And that is what guides us to determine whether or not we grant patent protection for any type of innovation. So there's statutes that say that the invention has to be new, it has to be non-obvious, et cetera. So we have actually 4 different statutes, and those are what control the examiner's decision.
How, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, we talked about this in preparation for today, when the USPTO decides that something is a patentable innovation, the degree of innovation is not something the USPTO can really, from a policy standpoint, do anything about. The same 20-year monopoly is given to a relatively incremental innovation and a game-changing generational innovation. How do you think about that in terms of the way that the flexibility the USPTO has to truly reward innovation versus more incremental advances?
Well, you know, I look at that slightly differently. I mean, you are absolutely correct that once we grant a patent, the life of the patent is the same, and that's regardless of the nature of the innovation. What we do tell examiners is their job is not to look so much at their views of the efficacy so much of any particular invention, but they really are to apply the statutes. And once they determine that something meets the statutory criteria, they will award a patent. And that is true for improvement innovations as well as groundbreaking technology. It is one size fits all. One of the myths that I hear very often is people can extend patents, and I get this question a lot. People can extend a patent by filing another one and change the color, say, of a drug. That is not the case. Something like that would not meet the minimum threshold of what the statutes require. So once we have met those requirements, then of course we would issue the patent. And it would be one size fits all in terms of timing.
Is there anything that, and this will be my final question to you before we go to Marcus, is there anything that you feel we should be thinking about as a society, as the public, as policymakers, about what are the ways in which the statutes that you work under limit your ability to truly reward innovation versus these more incremental advances?
You know, I think that the system, in my opinion, is absolutely correct in awarding patents for incremental advances as long as they're sufficient under the statutes and groundbreaking technology. I don't feel that there should be, this is my own personal opinion, don't feel there should be a distinction. I recently had the pleasure of hearing an inventor talk, a person who had come up with multiple pharmaceuticals to help cure disease, and she was asked a similar type of question, and the response was really interesting. She said, if we don't permit improvement patents to be issued, right, then it's the patients who will suffer. And she gave an example of, look, if you have, say, a medicine that needs to be, injected, and I don't remember the exact word, so I'm gonna paraphrase, I'll take some liberty a little bit, but if you, have somebody carry around some big device to be able to put the medicine inside them and to be able to take advantage of that, and you can make improvements to that, so over time now a person is taking maybe a pill a week or a pill a month, for example, that's real innovation that changes people's lives and changes people's lives for the better. So I do think the system appropriately rewards innovations, and I don't want to give anybody the impression that my opinion is an incremental improvement is something less worthy than a groundbreaking change. Most of the innovations are in fact incremental, but they are critically important to, in this case, to patient care.
Marcus, at the FTC, I think of the FTC, and I think most people who follow the FTC think of it as the antitrust watchdog. You're looking at trying to enforce the law when it comes to anti-competitive practices. Is that the right way to think about the FTC, or is there a broader range of ways that the FTC gets into the issue of drug pricing?
So first of all, let me, like Drew, thank BPC for inviting me and also for hosting this really timely event. And I am required by FTC regulations to disclaim that these are just my own opinions. So you ask an interesting question. FTC is primarily a law enforcement agency. That's what the significant portion of our resources are devoted to. But when Congress created us back in 1914, gave us a number of other authorities. So we do have the ability to do independent studies and research, to actually compel companies to turn over documents, internal documents that allow us to do studies. It's known as a 6B study because of FTC Act, Section 6B. We do conduct hearings. We do have workshops. In fact, as I look across the room, I see a number of professors and others who have participated in some of these workshops, industry stakeholders also who have participated in workshops and hearings. So we do have a number of additional tools in addition to the law enforcement. But we are primarily a law enforcement agency, and that's primarily what I'm responsible for with an office of about 35 other attorneys. I don't know if you want me to get into what we do yet or let you
Please,
ask.
go ahead.
Just have you ask me the question.
No, go ahead.
I'll preempt the question. But I do think it's important because you have this thing called the U.S. FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, sitting over here, which is clearly a regulatory agency. It is important to draw a distinction between what they do and what we do at the FTC because, as I said, we are a law enforcement agency. We're not really a sector regulator. And the laws we apply harken back to 1890 and 1914, and they're designed to promote a competition. So in the United States, I think most people understand we're not price regulators in this country. We don't regulate the price of pharmaceuticals. We rely on a market-based system, and a market-based system by definition relies on competition to try to hopefully produce the optimum outcome of price and quality and products that are available for people. So what we do in my office is we investigate and we prosecute alleged anti-competitive behavior. We do that in the pharmaceutical sphere involving pharmaceutical companies, both branded and generic companies, but it can also involve other people in what I would call the chain of distribution, drug wholesalers, retailers, pharmacy benefit managers, and all the way down to the retailing system. There's basically, broadly speaking, there's sort of three forms I'm giving now. In 1 minute, I'm going to give you a semester-long antitrust class, or try to. There's basically three broad forms of anti-competitive behavior. One is to look at agreements and restraint of trade. A good example of that touches on it directly on the issues we're talking about today is what's known, sometimes colloquially known as pay for delay or reverse payment agreements. That's an issue I personally have been working on for 20 years, right from the start. I'm one of the 3 people left at the FTC who started this project back in 1999 and have continuously, without interruption, continued to work on it. These touch on these issues because what happens is sometimes brand and generic companies are in patent litigation with each other. At some point, they look at each other and say, why are we spending all this money fighting over this patent? Why don't we settle the litigation? And as part of the settlement, we allege, the FTC alleges and comes in and says, what you've done is the brand is now paying the generic to no longer compete, to stay out of the market for some period of time. Now, you'd think that's pretty obviously wrong. I mean, I think most people naturally would think there's something wrong with that. Well, it took us until 2013 to get the Supreme Court to say there was something wrong with that. We actually had 3 courts of appeals that said it was perfectly appropriate because they were settling patent litigation, and that made all the difference. Well, we've managed to reverse that problem, although, you know, there's still some cases kicking around, and we still have a couple cases out there working their way through the Third Circuit and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. A second area that we look at is single firm conduct. So one of the things that the FTC managed to do with the pay-for-delay cases, the reverse payment cases, we actually managed to unite branded pharma and generic pharma against us. Because they both want to do those types of agreements. The problem is consumers get later generic competition and don't get the benefit of lower priced products. But most of the rest of our cases focus primarily on branded firm conduct, single firm conduct, acts of what we call monopolization. And a good example of that is a case we had that's now working its way through the Third Circuit, but we brought the trial up in Philadelphia, where we alleged that a company, AbbVie, that had a patent, that had gotten legitimately a patent from the PTO, was now asserting that patent against a generic company to try to keep the generic out in litigation that it knew, or any reasonable person would know, it couldn't possibly win. It's a theory called sham litigation. It was recognized by the Supreme Court back in 1993 in a case. We're the first ones to ever take it all the way through trial. We won at trial. The judge ordered AbbVie to pay $497 million, which we hope to someday be able to give back to consumers who overpaid. But right now it's still on appeal, and all that's being held up. But that is a sort of a monopolization claim, where somebody's gone beyond what we believe the rights of the patent give them. And the last area is we also look at mergers, excuse me, mergers and acquisitions in the pharmaceutical industry. I don't think that's very topical for today. But what I really did want to do is make one little quick pitch for anybody who's really interested, since actually I took more than 1 minute. I think
it's like half a centimeter thick. I'm looking at it from the side.
This is our resume of all the cases we've ever done in the pharma industry. Merger cases, cases involving the chain of distribution, not just the manufacturers, the monopolization cases, the agreements and restraint of cases, trade cases. Don't go on the FTC's website looking for this, because our website doesn't work very well. Go to Google, type in FTC overview and pharmaceuticals, and you'll get this. And it's basically a description of every case we've ever done, reverse chronological order, and I'll give you a lot more detail than I could possibly give here today.
That's
so I
great.
wanted to make a pitch for that.
Beautiful plug. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you, Marcus, is one of the things that's interesting about this field in general is that there are different kinds of monopolies in pharmaceuticals. There are the ones that Drew and his colleagues create, legal, statutorily enforced monopolies. There are some of these others around, for example, orphan drug status, which is a different kind of legal market exclusivity. The FDA's effectively de facto market exclusivity when they just don't approve a competitive drug. There are a bunch of different aspects to this, but what I'm interested in is, how does the FTC think about that interaction between the fact that there's a lot of anti-competitive stuff that goes on that is about the imposition of legal monopolies by the government, by a different arm of the government?
So yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about that. And the reality for us is we have to take the system as a given. So whatever the system is, the patent rights, the exclusivities granted through the FDA processes, inherent in these markets, for anybody who's an economist out there, is the fact that there are very high barriers to entry. You can't just start selling a product. You have to go through a regulatory process, prove that your product is safe and effective. That can take many years, even for a generic product. There's a lot of pieces that are at play. But again, we fundamentally have what is intended to be a market-based system. And under this market-based system, the way we look at it, or at least the way I do, is that it strikes a bargain. It strikes a bargain between the public, and it strikes a bargain with the pharmaceutical companies. Part of it is inherent in the patent system, as Drew just explained. Patents are fundamentally a government granted right. It's a public right. It's a public thing. And so we have this system. And what we expect to have happen generally is it can be thought of as sort of potentially 3 periods of different types of competition. There could be a period 1 where somebody comes up with a really new, brand new, innovative brand product, and our system allows them to charge whatever the market will bear. You come up with this treatment that cures hepatitis C, and you're the only one that's got it, you can pretty much charge whatever you want at whatever the market will bear. That's period 1. In period 2, somebody else may come along, another branded pharmaceutical might come along, a company might come along and develop what sometimes pejoratively, I think, sometimes is called a Me Too product, but they create something quite similar, but not exactly the same, a differentiated product for those economists out there. This is, again, for the economists, this is a form of a Bertrand competition, differentiated product competition, where the products aren't exactly identical and aren't exactly replaceable for each other, but a health plan might choose to put one on the formulary, the other, and the way they do that is by pitting the 2 companies against each other to bid for the PBM contract or the health plan contract, and as a result of that, you do get some price competition, but not the robust price competition that you get in period 3, where your generic's supposed to be allowed to come in. Patents have expired, or they've been proved to be invalid, or they are proved to be non-infringed, or the exclusivity periods have ended, and now we would expect that generic would start to enter. And in some instances, and we know this because there's a lot of history and there's a lot of economic studies that show this, there can be extremely robust price competition as 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 generics come in. Price can actually be competed down to marginal cost of making the pills. That's about the ultimate definition of competition. And so what we're watching out for is people who go past what the rules allow in any of those spheres. And generally that would be in periods 2 and 3, not necessarily in period 1 if somebody has a legitimate patent. But antitrust may have something to say. I'm not saying it's a particularly powerful weapon in all instances, but in certain circumstances, if we can prove either the requirements of an agreement of restraint of trade or an act of monopolization, we might be able to address some of the conduct where people have taken whatever legitimate patent rights they have, whatever legitimate exclusivities they have, and simply cross the line.
Let me ask you a question about the pay for delay. And by the way, I kind of want to see the before and after photos of when you started in 1999 on the project and now. But the counter argument that we hear about the pay for delay stuff is that, hey, as you said, this is patent litigation. Neither the brand company or the generic knows who's going to win in court. They obviously both have an independent evaluation of who they think has the advantage, but they don't know for sure. And the so-called payment is effectively a settlement that says, hey, let's split the difference somewhere between where you think the patent expires and where I think it does. And that's just normal litigation practice. What makes this different? What makes this anti-competitive?
Okay, so two things. First of all, the pictures wouldn't be
when they don't know.
The pictures you want to see wouldn't be very pretty because this process has aged me faster than when I was in the Army, I worked with nuclear weapons. I didn't age as fast. I mean, let's do a simple thought experiment. Everybody out there is a generic company. I'm the branded company. You're the FTC sitting on the sidelines watching this. We're in litigation. We're fighting it out. I'm saying you infringe my patents. And you should stay out. You're saying, no, your patent's not even valid, and in any event, I don't infringe it. I've invented around it. I should be allowed to come in. And we're duking this out heavily, and it's gone on for 30 months. We've gone through motions to dismiss. We've gone through summary judgment. Judge is about to tee up a trial, and we suddenly look at each other and say, why are we spending millions of dollars litigating? Let's settle this. So I, as the branded company, go to you, and we don't just split the patent term. And if we just split the patent term, we wouldn't have a problem with that. If there were 10 years left on the patent, we each said 5 years each, we wouldn't have a problem with that.
Let's say the generic thinks the patent's going to expire in January 2020, and the drug company thinks the branded company says January 2025, split it in the middle.
They come up with some kind of a straight-up time split, no problem. Yeah. But now let's say instead of just time splitting, I say, and by the way, I as the brand, the supposed patent holder, you're the supposed infringer, the alleged infringer. I'm going to pay the putative infringer $100 million and split the time. Now, you tell me what that means. Are we getting the same time split we would have gotten without the payment, or am I getting something that likely runs longer than the split that we would have done absent the agreement, or if we had gone all the way through litigation, what the likely probabilistic outcome of the litigation would have been. We have now come up with a very different deal. That's why it's called reverse payments, by the way, because normally in a patent lawsuit, and I think Drew can attest to this, normally in a patent lawsuit, you'd expect the putative infringer to pay for the right to enter. Here, the patent holder, the alleged, or the person who really does hold the patent, is paying the putative infringer to stay out. And the Supreme Court in Activist said it is that elimination of the risk of competition, the use of your monopoly profits to pay your competitor to avoid the risk of competition, that is the antitrust violation.
I see your blood pressure rising. As
Yeah,
you
well,
say
I'm
that,
sorry.
so
I still get excited about it. What can I say?
It's great. Somebody needs to, right? Well, we have 10 minutes left before we get to Q&A. I want to bring us to this issue of patent thickening, which in particular, in my view or my assessment, affects this new generation of biologic drugs that are going off patent. With the small molecules, we seem to have a pretty good process, simple chemical compounds where you've got the Orange Book, you've got these couple of patents, they get litigated through the Hatch-Waxman process that was generated or built up in 1984, and that seems to work reasonably well. Whatever you think of the price when the drug's on patent, when the patents start to expire, you get the generic competition, the commodity pricing, all the things that we appreciate. But with the biologics, these much more complex molecules where there are hundreds of patents instead of a handful that really matter, that's where you're starting to see a lot of what you described, Marcus, in terms of the extra litigation by an AbbVie or another player that's got a biologic. In the case of AbbVie, Humira is their big product. It's one of the largest, if not the largest drug in the U.S. right now in terms of revenue. This is an area where we're seeing a lot more drugs that are biologics, and the first generation of those are going off patent, but we're not really seeing that competition, that off-patent competition. Maybe starting with you, Drew, how do you think about that element of the puzzle here?
Sure. I hate to simplify that down to what we do with all patent applications, but what we do is we look to see whether there's patentable subject matter, and we will issue the patent. And it is as simple as that. And I know that people are concerned that any particular biologic could have numerous patents on it. And there's some myths that I've heard that I'm happy to address. But the idea.
Tell us about some of the myths.
Sure. So one of the myths is that you can continue to file additional patents and just extend the life. And I mentioned this earlier, and that really is not the case. If we're doing our job at PTO and you have what you believe is a secondary patent or an improvement patent to something, and we determine that it's not patentably distinct from the first one, we will make somebody file what's called a terminal disclaimer. So they have to disclaim the end of the patent, so that even if they get a patent, it runs coincident in term with the original. And that way you are not able to extend the life beyond. On a related note, though, if you have truly new innovation that we want to incentivize and bring to market, you would get a new patent and you wouldn't have to file the terminal disclaimer that I mentioned. And that could have a longer term, but that's a separate patent. The original patent would still have its expiration date and it would expire. So for us, we're making the call with each individual patent application whether it meets the statutory requirements. And interestingly enough, double patenting is part statutory and part judicial, but in any case, we make the call based on whether you're deserving of a new patent, and where you don't have something patently distinct, you can't extend the life.
Quickly, what about this thing you hear about called submarining, where they wait to submit the patent until enough time has passed so that they can maximize the exclusivity period?
Sure. There used to be something called submarine patents. They're really not prevalent now as we speak. What they were exactly, as you described, is people would delay the receipt of their patent, let markets build up, and then you get your patent when the markets have really built up, and then when you sue people, they have a lot more invested and would be more apt to pay high amounts of money. The laws changed many years ago so that patents, to prevent this exact reason. So patents now are 20 years from the time of filing, so that if you're delaying, you are wasting your patent term and you won't be able to have that submarine patent. The laws used to be such that they were 17 years from the time of issuance. So if you delayed your issuance, you'd still get that 17 years from that delay. That is no longer the case. So we're not seeing the problem with submarine patents.
Marcus, how about you? What do you think about the patent thickening issue broadly?
So, I mean, it's a tough one because, you know, there's no question there's an awful lot of patenting activity going on, and there's no question that patents can be used to slow down or prevent competition from other companies. The question is, for us, from an antitrust standpoint, is whether we can fit this into any recognized rubric of antitrust law. Because again, ultimately, the FTC is an antitrust law enforcer, not a sector regulator. My office happens to specialize in pharmaceuticals and healthcare, but we also do every other thing you can imagine. You know, office supplies and all kinds of other products. Any products that are out there, we potentially can look at. So we need to fit it. And the patent thicket concept itself has had not a very glorious history going back to some years ago where this theory was pursued as an antitrust case and didn't get very far. I am looking, however, at a front row here of a number of academics who are really smart, spend a lot of time writing really interesting papers, and maybe if one of them can write a paper that can convince us that we can fit this into that rubric. But as Drew's pointed out, I mean, if somebody legitimately gets a patent or legitimately gets 150 patents and they use those patents in a legitimate way, that's just not a question for antitrust to resolve. If somebody was concerned about patent thickets, there's going to have to be some other type of reform. It's going to have to come from Congress. It's going to have to come from the laws that Congress passes, and not something that we can squeeze into a framework that just doesn't work. Because at the end of the day, you know, all I can do is bring a case in court, and we try to bring cases that we at least have some chance of winning. I mean, I'm not saying we're afraid of losing, because we're not, but we don't want to bring cases where we know we're dead bang going to lose it on a motion to dismiss.
Where do you think the law as it exists puts you at a disadvantage in terms of thinking about this problem more broadly of anti-competitive practice? What are some of the things you'd love to go after but you can't because the law basically allows it or enables it?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily that the law enables it or allows it, but that's close enough question that it becomes difficult. And again, you know, in my job, I sometimes think of myself as something of a portfolio manager. I have a certain number of resources, which are primarily my time and the time of the people who work in my office, and a certain amount of money for experts and a certain amount of money for litigation expenses. And I have to make judgments about how I'm going to invest these resources. And, you know, the closer, tougher cases, you know, they can be extremely huge resource commitments and end up not having a good chance of being successful. But the areas where I think that there's, you know, scope for reform, and a lot of this is being talked about on the Hill right now. I mean, again, this is why this program is really timely. There's a whole bunch of different legislation that's being kicked around. Now, I'm not here to endorse any particular bill, but I will say that me and my colleagues at the FTC have spent quite a bit of time doing technical assistance with staffers at both the House side and the Senate side, also with the Congressional Budget Office as they score these bills. And we're trying to guide them on how to think about some of these issues, at least from our perspective. But of course, they have to balance that against the patent laws. They have to balance that against food and drug concerns and HHS and all those others. But I would think things like, despite the success we've had in reverse payments, I would, if it were up to me, I'd love to see some legislation on that. I'd love to see some legislation on what are known as REMS and restricted distribution systems, where the brand restricts the distribution so much that even a generic company can't even get the samples it needs to do the FDA testing to get approved as a generic version. I'd like to see some reform on citizens petitions. Michael Carrier, professor right here, has written a lot about that. I think Robin Feldman here has also written about that. Product hopping is something that's interesting, and there's potential there. So I think there's potential things that are already being discussed, that are being debated, are being discussed, that have, you know, collectively the opportunity to make some differences on the margin.
Drew, is the way the USPTO thinks about the word innovation, is innovation in the USPTO's mind the same as what is a patentable filing, or is there some distinction, there's obviously overlap between the two, but is it 100% identical, or are there differences between how the USPTO thinks about the word innovation and the way the USPTO thinks about a patentable filing?
So we have over 8,000 examiners, and we train them all that that innovation, as far as they're concerned, for their job is the patent statutes, and they should be looking at those statutes and applying the law. And when you meet the criteria of the statutes, you're deserving of a patent. When you don't, you don't. And so we try to keep it that way. I was actually thinking about the prior question, and you know, that you asked. If I can change this a little bit,
please, go ahead.
Just something I wanted to add. You know, you asked about some limitations on law of where you know, what would help in potential antitrust suits. We at the PTO, I mean, one issue that I see that's interesting is the concern that I have personally of where an examiner issues a patent. How do we ensure that somebody who's going to enforce that patent is actually enforcing it to the level of what the examiner thought was patentable and not going beyond that? And so part of what's really critical in my role is making sure we train examiners and train them not only to understand what the statutes and when something is deserving of a patent, but train them so that they can understand and clarify the patent examination record, so that they're being very clear, so that it's much more challenging, difficult for somebody to overuse the patent, at least more than what was in the examiner's mind. That's a critical issue for us.
That's very interesting. Okay, we've got some time for questions. If anyone has a question, raise your hand, and there are mics floating about. Let's go to the gentleman in the front row.
So
Let's wait for the mic, though. And introduce yourself, please.
Mike Carrier from Rutgers Law School. Marcus, for patent thicketing, can you imagine anything that could be found in a document in terms of intent that could give the FTC some comfort in bringing a case? So for example, you look at the Humira case, Boehringer was the one biosimilar that was challenging it. There are tons of documents in that case that said, we want to build a broad patent estate, we want to make it, quote, virtually impossible to bring a biosimilar to the market without infringing. I know that intent evidence is really hard because the right to exclude is consistent with keeping competitors out of the market. But if there's any document that shows that really the purpose here was to hurt biosimilars and not about innovation, would that give you any leg to stand on, or you're worried about it with the courts?
Well, I would still be worried with that about the courts. I mean, you're the professor, but as far as I remember from my antitrust classes, intent by itself really isn't, it's not really a core element of an antitrust case. Of course we care about why people are doing what they're doing, and a judge is going to care, and people are going to want to hear the story, but it's pretty clear to me that that alone is not enough. If they're getting patents perfectly legitimately, and they're getting lots of patents perfectly legitimately, and they're asserting those patents perfectly legitimately in litigation, I just don't see where that intent evidence is going to get you across the threshold. I just don't.
Further questions?
Bobby Pestronk. Can either of you talk about the issue of the subsequent cost of patented medicines to the consumer or to insurance or to insurers? This seems to be an issue that is gaining a lot of currency for a variety of reasons.
Sure, I can start. Obviously, I think the point that many people are trying to make here, including myself, is that there's a lot of complexities that go into the pricing of drugs. Patents certainly play a role. FDA exclusivity plays a role. The level of competition plays a role. So it's really hard to, in my mind, to draw a line to any one of those and say that this result, and you end up with this particular price. So I do think it's a very complex issue where all of these issues play a factor. So real hard to answer with specificity your question.
Drew, in Europe, there's an opposition procedure where a drug gets to market or a patent is filed, and the putative competitors can actually challenge the issuance of that patent immediately, that is to say, well before the drug actually would go off patent. The America Invents Act, in theory, enables that sort of what's called inter partes review in the U.S. Has anyone tried to use that, or I mean, is that process coming to the fore, or is that not really going anywhere here?
No, so you are entirely correct. If there's an issued patent, it can be challenged, the day after it issues at the PTAB or in the courts. PTAB is the Patent Trial and Appeal Board. It is very much being used for challenging of patents in not only the pharmaceutical area but in all areas.
Great. Well, let's see if we have someone else on. If not, I can go to you. Go ahead. You have a follow-up, or is there anyone else who had a question? Go ahead. We got one right there. Gentleman in the gray shirt.
This is a question for the commissioner. Thanks for participating.
Please introduce yourself.
Zane Rizvi, a public citizen. There was a really fascinating story in the Washington Post last week that alleged that Gilead, which is a company that makes HIV drugs, developed two compounds, TDF and TAF-based compounds. They were running studies on TDF and TAF. They introduced a TDF-based compound. And as they were running the studies on the TAF-based compound, they found some evidence to suggest that the TAF-based compound was safer. However, because they had already introduced the TDF-based compound, they didn't want to cannibalize their own sales, and so they decided to delay developing the TAF-based compound for a number of years. Then in 2010, as soon as they saw that the TDF-based compound, what patent expiration was coming, and they wanted to introduce the TAF-based compound, they restarted the development of the process of the TAF-based compound. So it all seems, a little murky, but what makes it even more kind of egregious is that Gilead then came to the PTO and came to the FDA and said, hey, we actually need some patent term extension because the FDA is taking too long to develop or to review our process. And so now I think they've been either tentatively granted or there's still some hope that the PTO could intervene. And in the Washington Post article, the PTO declined to comment. And I was wondering if you had any more, if anything more you could say about this particular case. And if not about the particular case, then just in general, how can we enhance the safeguards that make sure that companies are not being rewarded for this kind of intentional delay that actually harms patients?
Sure. So I think you can probably recognize I can't talk about the specifics. There is a petition currently filed with USPTO on this issue, so I can't talk any specifics to this particular case. The way the process works when somebody is seeking patent term extension is the PTO and the FDA work in concert together, and the PTO's role is more of an administrative role. We seek from the FDA their calculations of what the regulatory delays are, and those are what goes into our calculations. So the interplay there is one of PTO getting the information from the FDA, where they will do the background work, so to speak, to evaluate any delays in the patent, and they come over to PTO, give that information to us, and we are more of the on the administrative side of putting that into the statutes and calculating what the result is based on what the FDA provided to us. That's the process.
Great. With that, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Drew and Marcus. Appreciate it.
That was a terrific start this morning. I want to thank Ovik and the Commissioner and Marcus. We're going to continue this morning's event with our second panel. My name is Anand Parekh. I'm the Chief Medical Advisor here at BPC, so I want to, as Bill did, welcome all of you who are here today and all of you who are watching via webcast. We really have a distinguished second panel today of national experts, academic leaders, who will, I think, react to our first panel as well as dive a little bit deeper on some of these issues. All four of them, who I'll introduce in a second, have performed empiric studies on various pharmaceutical patent practices or on the patent process itself broadly, in addition to other related non-patent practices that may impede competition, as you've heard about earlier this morning. So to my left, immediate left, we have Professor Michael Carrier, law professor from Rutgers University. We have Professor Robin Feldman, professor from the University of California, Hastings, Professor Artie Rai, who's a law professor at Duke University, and then Professor Melissa Wasserman, who is a law professor at the University of Texas at Austin. So first off, just a tremendous panel, and thanking them in advance for the work that they've done. We're going to be doing a little bit of a sprint here in this second panel, and we're going to be trying to cover product hopping and evergreening, citizens petition, processes and potential abuses, biosimilar patent thickets, as you've heard about, as well as more broadly patent quality. And hearing from our academic experts about the research that they've done in this area, the challenges as well as potential solutions. At the end, prior to perhaps going to audience Q&A, perhaps we can get into some of the issues that we're talking about in the first panel, including pay for delay and sample sharing, perhaps even the Orphan Drug Act. So we'll try to cover as much ground as we can, and then we look forward, audience, to your question and answer. And maybe Professor Feldman, I can start with you. You recently published a study examining the extent to which evergreening behavior exists in the non-biologic drug market. So evergreening, product hopping, as you've heard, is essentially extending the protection cliff by adding either on-patent or non-patent exclusivities. Professor Feldman, you found in your study, I think, that 78% of the drugs associated with new patents were not new drugs coming on the market, but existing drugs. And I'm curious, what surprised you the most in your study and on the results? Was it the percentage? Was it the timing of the new patent in relation to the market exclusivity of the drug? Or was there something else that surprised you in your study?
Well, we were looking at an entire 10-year period of all the non-biologic drugs on the market and every single extra patent and exclusivity that was added to it. I was expecting to see some recycling and repurposing of drugs. That wasn't a surprise, but 78% was a very high number. To step back and say that 78% of the drugs associated with new patents were not new drugs, but existing ones, that's a striking result.
Sure. I want to go back to a point the Commissioner made, the importance of incremental innovation. I think we can all agree that when incremental innovation improves health outcomes through convenience or safety adherence, we all realize that's important. But based on your study, are there any proposals or potential solutions that you've landed on where one might be able to draw the line between the important innovation that we want to see and potential abuse? Where do you draw the line? How do you make sense of this?
So science sometimes moves in small increments, sometimes in large leaps. The question in my mind isn't whether incremental innovation is important. The question is whether the market reward is sufficient or whether we need government to intervene in the market. So when companies make these secondary changes to a patent, adjusting the dosage or delivery system and then getting a new patent on top of it, the research and development costs are much lower than what's required for creating the initial drug to begin with. In that context, the market should be able to provide the reward for that change. It's the extraordinary investment that it takes to bring the initial drug to market. That's where we want government to put its thumb on the scale and to allow 20 years of protection for the drug company. So let me just give you one example to bring it to life, one of the patents that we looked at. It's a drug that already existed. It had a coating around it to absorb and make sure it didn't bother your stomach. Patent was expiring. The drug company came in and got a second patent for a new ineffective capsule that went around the original drug. It did absolutely nothing. Even the FDA agreed it's the same thing. It does nothing. We don't have to look at it very much. But now there's a new patent, and that is a new period of protection. So again, it doesn't cost very much to make this secondary change. In my view, the market often can reward that. You don't need government intervening in the market.
Professor Carey, you've thought about this as well, particularly in the context of how courts could consider a framework for antitrust analysis. I think you've argued that the courts should go beyond looking at just the impacts on the market, hard switches, soft switches, to the actual economic impact of evergreen product hopping. I think Professor Feldman's alluding to that as well. Can you elaborate on your thinking in this matter?
Sure. So we need to set the context. Brand companies reformulate drugs all the time. Just about all those reformulations are completely fine. So empirical analysis has shown that 80% of these reformulations take place outside what's known as a generic window, a time that we expect generic competition. So for brand companies making a switch, At a time like that, there's nothing to worry about. In contrast, there are some switches that are made just to keep the generic off the market. Sometimes the brand company has the innovation, sticks it in its back pocket for 3 or 5 or 10 years, and introduces it just when the generic is about to enter the market. Sometimes the brand company will pull a profitable drug off the market. Sometimes a brand company will disparage its own product. And so what we've seen in the courts is this really harsh distinction between what are known as hard switches and soft switches. With a hard switch, the brand company pulls the old drug off the market. With a soft switch, it keeps the old drug on the market. As I see it, the courts have figured out that hard switches can present a problem because consumers have less choice than they had before. The first product hopping case was the Tricor case involving a cholesterol drug. Then you have the Namenda case involving an Alzheimer's drug. And the courts there saw that there was a problem. The tricky issue in the courts is that they don't quite see that a soft switch can be anti-competitive as well. So what they say is the Walgreens case was the first one that dealt with it. Prilosec switches to Nexium, and the court says, oh, look, you have 2 products in the market, 2's better than 1, consumers have a choice, therefore no problem. Courts cannot get it here because it just seems like you have a choice. Nonetheless, because this is not like any other industry, and the price disconnect shows that the person that pays for it, the insurance company or consumer, is very different than the party that prescribes it, the doctor, there is a real problem. So I've offered a no economic sense test. Does it make any sense at all for the brand company to do what it is doing? That's part of S1416 introduced by Senator Cornyn that says it's not just about the hard switch. A soft switch can be a problem as well. If a brand company literally has no reason for doing what it is doing, that presents competitive concern.
I think we'll probably get back to this, and particularly related to pending legislation. I want to briefly move to a separate topic, Professor Carrier, while you have the stage, which is the use of citizens' petitions, a process to raise legitimate safety concerns at the FDA that could potentially delay generic entry of a drug. You've studied this issue. I know Professor Feldman studied this issue as well. Professor Carrier, how pervasive is this challenge? What is being done about it? What could be done about it that's not really being done?
In theory, a citizen petition sounds like a good thing. It's a citizen petitioning the FDA that there is a safety concern, so the FDA has to look into it. In reality, it is not that. And so if you look at 505Q petitions, which are petitions that target pending generic entry, I found that just about all of them, 92%, are filed by brand companies. The FDA denies just about all of them, 92%. That's 98% in the last 6 months before the end of an exclusivity period. Professor Feldman has found that 40% of these are filed within the year in which you expect the generic to be approved. So empirically, this is a problem. What can be done? You could file a lawsuit. The FTC has filed a lawsuit there, and on the merits, it is good. Sometimes in terms of remedies, maybe it's not so good, and maybe Congress could do something on that. Congress can pass legislation on this. So the FDA technically has this ability to summarily deny a petition if, quote, the primary purpose is delay. FDA has never done this because it's impossible to find primary purpose based on the face of a document. But there is legislation in Congress that would deal with this problem. There's a whole bunch of factors where we all know that these are frivolous petitions. Also, there are potential pieces of legislation that would require these petitions to be filed within a short period of time before finding out. When you find out that there's a problem, you can't wait for years, as Mylan did in the EpiPen case. There's other legislation that would require the FDA to make more information available because there's a real transparency issue. So there are several proposals being considered right now that would help address the problem.
Professor Feldman, would you like to add?
I would just say that the amount of time government wastes responding to these frivolous petitions is just a remarkable amount of waste. So in some years, 1 out of every citizen petition filed at the FDA on any topic, and that includes food and dietary supplement and devices and tobacco, 1 out of 5 of every petition is about trying to delay generic competition. And that's just such a waste of government time.
I want to move on to Professor Rye to the issue of patent thickets. This was brought up in the first panel, and particularly as related to biosimilar market entry. This is an area you've studied closely. You were at PTO previously. From your perspective, how might patent practices be potentially impeding biosimilar entry?
So as many of you probably know, the FDA has approved 26 biosimilars, and of those 26, 11 have entered. So I believe Mr. Hoagland at the beginning said that fewer than 2/3 of generics that have been approved have entered the market, but in the biosimilar context, it's about 40%, so it's much lower than for ordinary generic drugs. And we have some, real poster children. Obviously, everyone talks about Humira. Enbrel is another poster child where there have been a number of biosimilars approved, but nothing has entered the market. And the reason is, to a significant extent, these thickets. Now, these thickets are not necessarily that different from what you see in the evergreening context with respect to small molecules, so the terminology is perhaps suggests more of a difference than there really is. That said, my research has indicated that there is one significant difference, and this relates to the science of biologics versus small molecules. As many of you probably know, making a small molecule is pretty straightforward. If once you know the structure, any good chemist can reverse engineer and make it. So on average, it takes a few $1 million for a generic company, once the relevant patents have expired, to make the chemical. With biologics, that is not the case. With biologics, it usually takes $100 to $200 million to A, reverse engineer, and then B, prove to the FDA that what you have reverse engineered is similar enough to the originator biologic that the FDA should approve it. Now, you might ask, why is it that you have to spend all this time reverse engineering and proving to the FDA all this information when there is a patent that is supposed to disclose how to make and use the invention, i.e. the patent on the biologic? Well, turns out that almost no biologic of which I'm aware actually discloses how to make and use the invention, because that would be giving away the secret sauce, and even though that is a requirement of the patent statute, it doesn't happen. So what does happen? Well, in the research I have done with Professor Nicholson Price, we've looked at, currently we're just looking at litigated biologics because that's the easiest way to get the relevant patents. There is no orange book for patents, and so it's very difficult to figure out what the relevant patents are from the originator's standpoint. Mr. Amin has done some work on that, but that's very, very time intensive. So we're just looking at litigated patents. Many of those are patents filed after the originator biologic has been approved on methods for making the biologic. So that's interesting. So that sort of method information should have been in the first application, but it's not. And so we're arguing that either the originator patent is not enabled, or even if they've changed the method such that the originator patent couldn't have included the method, there should be a way of making the originator patent without impeding or infringing, those subsequent method patents. And these method patents are the bulk of the thickets. So that's the essence of the problem that we see that is specific to the biologics context, is that there's so little transparency about methods. And the PTO doesn't know what the biologic originator was using. The FDA doesn't necessarily know what they were doing they may know a little bit more, but not at the time of application filing. There's just almost no transparency about those method patents.
And so based on the challenge, you were instrumental in creating PTAB, which is the Patient Trial and Appeals Board. What could the role be here at PTO or at FDA or PTO working perhaps with FDA to try to get at some of this?
So I think both the PTAB and PTAB is after the fact, so Patent Trial and Appeals Board challenges after the fact, as you note, and then I think there are things that could be done even before the fact. So let's start with after the fact, because I'm studying the PTAB right now and empirical work I'm doing on the biopharmaceutical industry. So I haven't seen many of these challenges, but there have been a few. Challenges to patents that basically should never have issued because the originator was using the patent secretly for more than a year before they filed. Under law that has been affirmed by the Supreme Court just recently, a case called Helsin, and that dates back now many decades. The PTO is not supposed to approve the patents. Now, of course, they do because they don't know. They don't know by what process the molecule was made. And so they'll approve a method patent that might be, have been used for much more than a year before it was filed. And that's the sort of situation where a competitor could go to the PTAB. We haven't seen too many of those, but we have seen a few. That's the PTAB. At the PTO, it seems to me that the FDA and the PTO could work together pursuant to statutory authority they already have on this question but have never used, to look at what kinds of patents are being filed after the originator biologic has been approved. And if they are method patents, those should have a big question mark next to them, because there could be a potential metallizing engineering problem, or at a minimum, if there isn't a metallizing engineering problem, there should be a way for the biosimilar to make the drug that doesn't use that patent. Because by definition, if there isn't a metallizing engineering problem, by the way, this is a very tricky patent argument, so if you're interested in the argument, it's in a Nature Biotechnology piece Professor Price and I published. But you can't have your cake and eat it too, essentially, and they are having their cake and eating it too.
Thank you, Professor Wasserman. I want to move to you and maybe take a step back and broader than sort of pharmaceuticals and just talk about patent quality for a moment. You've done quite a bit of research looking at patent quality, and you've argued that there's potential for invalid patents given just some of the processes at BTO, whether it's budget related or patient examiner turnover or backlogs. Can you discuss your findings of your empirical research based on the ability of PTO to fulfill its mission and how that may impact?
Yes. So I want to talk a little bit about my work that's co-authored with Michael Frakes, who is a law professor at Duke. And so there's a lot of talk about patent quality and concern that the Patent and Trademark Office may be issuing patents of low quality that may be invalid. And I think this is particularly relevant to pharmaceutical pricing, because to the extent a patent gets through that shouldn't have been allowed, right, that can possibly block generic entry for some particular point in time until it's litigated and invalidated in courts. But historically, we haven't had a lot of compelling empirical evidence that there may be any particular feature of the patent system that is actually causing, right, the agency to issue low-quality patents. And so as a result, policymakers are left trying to fix the system without understanding the root shortcomings. So Michael and I have really tried to fill this gap by using sophisticated empirical methodologies that get at causal inferences, that try to say this feature, right, is affecting, right, the agency's granting behavior. And so the feature I want to talk about today is the time allocations that are given to patent examiners, right, how much time they're given to review a patent application. So on average, examiners are spending 19 hours reviewing an application from start to finish, reading it, conducting a prior art search, responding to attorneys' arguments, etc. And so how it's set up at the patent office, as you get promoted up the GS level pay grade, right, you get less and less time to review applications. So it's about a 10 to 15% decrease in the time you're given to review application with each promotion. So by the time you get promoted up to the GS 14, you have about half the amount of time to review a patent application as you were as a GS 7. And because patent applications, when filed, are presumed valid, if a patent examiner isn't given enough time to conduct a prior art search, right, she may allow a patent that if she'd been given more time, she would have found relevant prior art and rejected. So to test this theory, what we did was track or follow individual examiners, right, over the course of their career at the patent office, including when they experience these time-reducing promotions. And what we do is track their grant rate, and we control for everything that would possibly affect the possibility that an application would be granted, such as the technology, the year it was filed, how much experience the examiner had. And we find as examiners get promoted up the GS level and the less and less time they get to review applications, their grant rate increases. And it's quite dramatic. By the time you get promoted all the way up to GS14, right, your grant rate increased by 18 percentage points or 27% from the time when you were a GS7 examiner, right, because we're tracking individual examiners. And importantly, what we find is that these additional patents examiners allow, right, when they're given less time to review applications or of more questionable validity. So how do we get at that? We look at the sample of patent applications that are filed in the US, Europe, and Japan. And we know historically, in particular, the European Patent Office, they just spend more resources reviewing each application than the US does. So they spend more time searching for prior art. They sometimes have multiple examiners that are reviewing one application. And so what we do is we look at examiners when you are an examiner at GS7, and we look at the patents that you allow, and we see what's the likelihood that those patents are also allowed in Europe. And what we see is you get promoted up the GS level and you get less and less time. The patents that you're allowing when you're GS14 are less likely to also be allowed in Europe than the ones that you were allowing at when you were a GS7, right, and had more time. And so we interpret these results to mean, right, that as examiners are given less and less time to review applications, right, they're more likely to be allowing patents of questionable validity. So what we've just done, I think that's really relevant for this panel, is extended this work for pharmaceutical patents that are listed in the Orange Book. And so what we've done initially is just sort of divided these applications into ones that are active ingredient and then the ones that are secondary patents. And so there's empirical evidence out there that have looked at when these active ingredients versus secondary patents get litigated in court, we find the secondary patents are much more likely to be invalidated than the active ingredients. And so we think these secondary patents may be of more marginal quality. And so what we've done, right, is we've looked at secondary patents, right, that are issued by examiners, and we track them like your secondary patent as a GS7 versus when you get up promoted to a GS14. And we find that when you as an examiner are allowing these secondary patents as a GS14, they're much more likely to be litigated in generics in court, right, which are suggesting, right, that these are more marginal quality. And then we've also looked to see the likelihood that those patents are also being issued in the EPO, for example, and we see the same pattern, right, that as you get promoted up at GS14, you get less and less time to review. Those secondary patents that you're allowing become less likely to be allowed in Europe as well. So we think this is really sort of interesting because we haven't done this yet. The next thing we want to do is try to put some price value associated with that, right? Because if that secondary patent was allowed and eventually, right, gets invalidated in court, we can kind of go back and see, well, if generic entry could have occurred much earlier, what is that really costing us? And this last thing I'll say is, and then what our sort of policy, right, what we love to see is that the Patent and Trademark Office, right, give examiners more time, especially if there's some way to flag these patents applications as they come in, right? If we know this is kind of a secondary patent associated with a drug that's already been approved or is in the FDA pipeline, right, that could be something where the PTO is like, okay, let's give this examiner some extra time because we know this patent is going to have economic value.
Yeah, you know, in follow-up to the issue of time, that's somewhat related to budget and the budget of the PTO. And, and the PTO just did recently publish a notice for proposed rulemaking to adjust patent fees to better cover its costs for patent operations. Commissioner also mentioned more training. From your perspective, are the steps that PTO is taking, are they getting at this, or are there additional steps that based on your research you'd like to see?
Yeah, so I know, and I commend the Patent Office. They have been looking at examiners' sort of time allocations, and they have been trying to increase them in targeted ways. But I would love to see them kind of do more, right? If there's ways to kind of see patent applications that come in that we know are going to have economic value, that seems like low-hanging fruit to give examiners more time. And I think what I just talked about with these secondary patents may be one area. I also think, right, as the PTO is looking at their sort of fee structure and they're moving towards more just cost recovery of everything they do, meaning more upfront fees to review patent applications to cover their costs, that's also a good thing for them to do because I think it increases the financial health of the agency.
Professor Rai, any additional input based on your time?
So I do think that there is, as Melissa points out, this category of patents that's got to be economically important and the cost-benefit analysis will clearly show you devote more time to them. And that's the category of patents that is filed after a drug has been approved. Because after a drug has been approved, we know for a fact that's an important area in which to look. Most patents, people can quibble about whether patents matter such that across the board we should have large increases in examiner time, because most patents don't end up being litigated or necessarily licensed. But this is a specific category of patents we know are important. And the one concern would be, are we unfairly targeting based upon industry, and would that be a violation of our international obligations not to discriminate among patents? I think that's an important and interesting concern, but I don't know that that's an insuperable concern, because we do have all sorts of other special ways we've looked at various patents at various times. We've just recently we're about to sunset on something called the covered business methods approach at the PTAB, which was specifically targeted to covered business methods. And so we have precedent on this sort of thing.
I want to, and we'll move to audience Q&A in just a couple of minutes. I do want to come back to Professor Feldman, Professor Carrier, just to touch on a couple of issues that were brought up during the first panel. Professor Carrier, both, I think, sample sharing in the context of REMS and pay for delay were brought up. Marcus at the FTC talked about them as well. Congress has been eyeing both of these areas for quite some time, it appears now. Are you comfortable with the direction Congress is moving in terms of, from a legislative perspective, getting at both of these issues, and where is Congress potentially getting it right, and what direction do they need to move in?
So Congress is getting it right to the extent that they're considering it. What they need to do is pass legislation that is bipartisan and deals with pay-for-delay settlements, sample denials, product hopping, and citizen petitions. These are all bipartisan pieces of legislation, Democratic and Republican co-sponsors. So start with the CREATES Act. CREATES Act requires a brand company to provide a sample to a generic. That was the core of the Hatch-Waxman Act. At the time of Hatch-Waxman in 1984, the generic had to redo all of the clinical studies. It couldn't offer any low-priced drugs because it had to do the same thing the brand had to do. And in Hatch-Waxman, Congress said, brand company, you can rely on the generic company, you can rely on the brand company's sample, and you don't have to replicate the clinical trial. So brand companies have now said, we're not going to give you a sample. And they make up all sorts of reasons. We have a safety concern, a product liability concern, and they're made up because, say, with the safety concern, the FDA will give a letter that says, we have no safety problems with what you're doing. It's completely fine. And the brand company says, well, it's nice the FDA thinks it's fine, but we have some other safety concerns. And so the CREATES Act is really a simple fix. It avoids antitrust law. It says that the brand company has to provide it, and if it doesn't, then there could be penalties. It allows the FDA to play a role with a covered product authorization. It provides protection from product liability. So it really is a simple solution, and it's necessary because, again, antitrust litigation is very costly, and the FDA has not been able to solve the problem. Former Commissioner Scott Gottlieb was really focused on this issue, and he said, quote, stop the shenanigans. Stop playing these games. The FDA tried so many things of shaming these companies. You go to the FDA's website, it lists all the companies that failed to provide a sample. It doesn't matter. So I think CREATES Act would be a lot of good. Pay-for-delay settlements is another area where Congress could act. So as Marcus Meyer said before, 2013, in FTC v. Activist, the Supreme Court said that these are anti-competitive agreements and could violate the antitrust laws. That is all correct, but there are lots of arguments that the brand and generic companies have every incentive to push every chance that they can get. And so I've analogized it to the mythological figure Sisyphus. Sisyphus is always pushing the boulder uphill. And every time he pushes the boulder uphill, it falls back. That's what's going on here. In other words, even though the court and activists rejected the scope of the patent test, every party comes into court and says, look, there's entry before the end of the patent term. That's a good thing. And sometimes courts buy it. So there's a case now that the FTC was involved in, an incredibly comprehensive opinion, one of the best opinions since Activists, that's now being appealed to the Fifth Circuit. And the reason is that, or what the generic company is saying, and what the ALJ, Administrative Law Judge, said below is, look, there's entry before the end of the patent term. That's good for the consumer. That's wrong, and it's foreclosed by activists. Or look at the Wellbutrin case in the Third Circuit, where the Third Circuit said risk aversion is a good reason for a large payment. Supreme Court said no, that's not the case. Supreme Court said risk aversion is not allowed. A large and unjustified payment is a surrogate, so you don't have to do the patent litigation. So the point is, you have all these courts that could make serious mistakes and undo activists. That's why legislation is needed. And then finally, legislation is needed to give the FTC a little assistance with all of these pay-for-delay settlements. Brand companies are no longer giving, as Marcus likes to say, a bag of cash to the generic. Rather, they're complicating it in all sorts of ways, really hard to find. Presumptive illegality makes a lot of sense when you have payment and delayed entry, and so that's why I think settlements and denial of sample legislation are really good things to consider.
Thank you. Professor Feldman, I want to end on Orphan Drug Act. Ovik mentioned this in the first panel, created in 1984, obviously a very important law, has done good in terms of bringing treatments for rare diseases. There are many rare diseases still there that need a treatment. But somewhere along the way, there seemed to be, based on research of yours and many others, potential challenges and potential abuses. And based on your empiric research, can you briefly summarize the lay of the land with respect to the law, the challenges, and potential solutions?
Sure. And Orphan Drug Act is such a wonderful name because who can oppose medicine for orphans? It's not exactly like that. It was passed in the early 1980s, and the intent was to provide incentives when there was no reasonable likelihood that the company could recover the costs of researching for the drug. Unfortunately, orphan drug status is now associated with large dollar returns. So the 7 of the 10 highest revenue drugs in 2015, 7 of those had orphan drug designations. It's somehow this goal of we are going to provide the benefit, the government's going to help you in the market if you can't get a return, that's gotten lost in the stampede. And it is a stampede. So the FDA just told us that last year, out of all of the drugs that were novel therapies, 58% had orphan drug designations. It would be a very strange world indeed if we were going to spend more than half of our time on drugs that affect small numbers of people. Going back to what I said in my first comments, when government intervenes in the market, you can get some very strange results, and orphan drug designation is one of those.
I think there are probably going to be quite a few questions, so we have mic runners on both sides. We'll move to audience Q&A. Just please raise your hand and introduce yourself, and we can proceed. Who has the first question? Great.
Bobby Pestrong. I just want to follow up on your last comment. So would you argue that the orphan drug legislation should be eliminated as a result of the perverse effects that it's had, or somehow amended to address those perverse effects?
No, the orphan drug legislation, in my view, needs to be completely reworked. To the extent that there are good things that you can do by trying to provide some incentives where there are small numbers of patients and companies aren't going to have the incentive to do it, that's great. And we've seen some wonderful examples of where that happened, but that's not what we're seeing across the board. If that's what you want, we need a very different type of structure to do it.
Can I ask a follow-up then?
Sure, and then we'll go over here. Yep.
So is the nature of the original legislation created by members of the industry or their representatives who recognized how advantageous it would be to have the current legislation? Or are they taking advantage of the legislation subsequently?
So there have been changes across time in what's happened, both in industry's ability to see how useful that particular legislative pathway is, and in terms of how the science has changed. So as we have moved to different types of science, it's become possible to do things with bioinformatics in which you slice your patient population into small pieces. This is particularly a problem in cancer therapeutics because to the extent that you can define a cancer population in very small ways, you can argue that every cancer therapeutic is an orphan drug if it's defined properly. None of this was anticipated at the time the Orphan Drug Designation, the Orphan Drug Act came into being. So it's a combination of brilliant innovation in the legal departments of the large companies, and then also how the market has changed and the science has changed. We have to adapt as well.
Was there a question on the side? Yes, please. So Mike, right here. Yep.
Thank you. Hi. So,
Please introduce yourself.
Sorry. Yes, I'm Charles Dwan with the R Street Institute. I'll be on the next panel. So there's been a lot of talk about invoking the NIH's margin rights or Section 1498 to deal with particular patents on particular drugs. I'm wondering if you can weigh in on the merits of that approach as opposed to some of these more general approaches to dealing with the patent system and dealing with the regulatory system that you've talked about so far.
Professor Rai.
So yeah, that's so just a little bit of background. Section 1498 is essentially the government's eminent domain power, which could apply to any patent across the board. Margin rights are for federally funded research, the result of which is a patent. So from the data I've seen, margin rights would probably apply to about 14% of molecules and about 25% of important ones. So it would be a very segmented slice. And in addition, to the extent we're talking about biologics, just dealing with the patent is only one small piece of the puzzle. See my prior comments about even when you get rid of the patent, you still don't know how to make the molecule. So I think that, and that's also an issue for biologics generally, even with eminent domain. So I think this is where we need to be acutely aware of the intersection of patents and trade secrecy in biologics and the operation thereof in a way that it doesn't operate similarly in the small molecule context. So for small molecules, I see some of the same issues with margin. It's selectively applied and maybe arbitrarily applied a little bit because a lot of the federal funding isn't necessarily that capacious. But with biologics, even eminent domain wouldn't necessarily work.
Other questions? One more in the back.
Hi, Paul Heldman from Heldman Simpson Partners. I just want to stay on 1498 because I believe it's at least in one presidential proposal to make wider use of. So could you talk a little bit more about your last comment about building on why it wouldn't work with biologics? And also, how has it been used in the past, especially in terms of, for pharmaceuticals, especially in terms of sort of what sort of royalties the manufacturer has to get? I mean, do they get something equivalent to what they would have been generating in terms of revenue without it?
So it has not been used recently with respect to pharmaceuticals, 1498. It has been used in the defense context. Defense is strange because the primary purchaser in defense is usually the government anyway, so you don't have a real market in the same way as you do in pharmaceuticals. It hasn't, to my knowledge, been used in pharmaceuticals recently. It was threatened in the context of the anthrax attacks and the Cipro situation where there might have been an insufficient production of Cipro. But in theory, the compensation would be sufficient to compensate for the breaking of the patent, but whether it would be reasonable royalties or lost profits, perhaps my colleagues can help on that, but there's a big difference between reasonable royalties and lost profits in terms of how much money you get, and that may be part of why it's such an anathema to the pharmaceutical industry.
Just to answer that, the old cases had royalties, as I recall, in the 10% range for using it as a license in that circumstance.
Which is very low. Yeah.
And why doesn't it work with biologics?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get to. So, okay, so you cut through all the biologics patents with a very low royalty, say, although you'd get stacking royalties perhaps as well, since there's so many patents. But more importantly, at that point, you still have to figure out how to make the molecule, because the patents don't generally teach you that. Even the patents that are filed later on after the originator has been approved. And so, and it gets more complicated as we get into more complicated biologics. So monoclonal antibodies, those are really hard to reverse engineer.
Any final questions? Yeah, one last question, and then we'll move on to the final panel.
Sort of a question, sort of a comment.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Zane Risby, Public Citizen. I've co-authored a paper on 1498 looking at some of these cases, and I guess my point of disagreement with Professor Rai would be that it's true, it could be potentially true that it's harder to make biologics initially, so the threat is weakened, but we've seen that just invoking the threat of 1498 is sufficient to bring companies to the table and negotiate in a meaningful way. And so if you define your, what works as lowering prices, then yes, 1498 can work. And the second point I would make is that if you look at the top 20 drugs by sales in the US, I believe there's 7 of them right now that have competition that already exists, and these include like biologics, right? So if you're talking about Humira is already in Europe, right? In the Nordic countries, you're getting 45 to 60% discounts. And so in this case, if the US were to invoke 1498, you would have rapid entry of biologics. And so while it's true that there might be some initial kind of early stage difficulties implementing 1498 with biologics, there's still an immense amount of potential, and I think that's one reason why you're seeing so many candidates talking about it. Plus, it's something that you don't have to go through Congress with, which is like also a plus.
That's completely fair, and this is one place where we always complain in the United States in our very nationalistic way that everyone else in the world free rides on our innovation. This is one place where we could free ride on the EU, because the EU has done so much in terms of making information about how to make Humira available.
Sure, yeah, last comment.
Yeah, so I just want to give a little bit of historical perspective on these different areas that contemplate the government stepping in, and it's a historical patent perspective. And I think the best statement I've seen of this is in a dissent written by Justice Thomas in a recent case in which he talked about the history of patents and the contrast between the patent right and core land property rights in the Constitution and the way they were treated. Patents aren't that type of core right. They are historically a franchise from the government for limited purposes and for limited times, and that's important to recognize. So from my perspective, one place that the government might legitimately think about stepping in this area is when there are shortages. So if there is a shortage happening, and we're seeing this more, then the government might legitimately say to the company, if you are not able to satisfy the demands here, we will license someone else to be able to do that. That's important. Understanding that, again, from the perspective that this is a grant from the patent is a grant from the government. We do it for the benefit of the society. It's not, in our concept, for the benefit of the inventor.
Well, with that, I want to thank all 4 of our distinguished panelists. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of your insights. Thank you. We're going to transition now to our 3rd panel. If I could ask them to come up. The 3rd panel will be moderated by Charles Dewan. Charles is the Director of Technology and Innovation at R Street. He'll be joined by Tahir Amin, co-founder and co-executive director at IMAC, Melissa Brand, who's Associate Counsel at BIO, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, and Karen Hessler, who's Assistant General Counsel at the Association for Accessible Medicines. Thank you, Charles.
Sorry, I gotta get my papers out. Thanks, Anand, for that introduction, and thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center for holding this really great event. I've learned a lot so far, and hope that you all have as well. So we are turning over to our stakeholder panel to look at some of the ongoing contemporary issues in patent policy. And for that, we have an excellent panel. Directly to my left, we have Tahir Amin, who is the co-founder and executive director of IMAC. He comes from 25 years of practice as a solicitor in the United Kingdom and also as Global IP Counsel for multinational corporations. He's advised the European Patent Office, the UN Environment Program, and the World Health Organization. So great deal of experience there. Continuing on, we have Karen Hessler, who is an Assistant General Counsel for the Association of Accessible Medicines. She was previously a partner at Wiley Ryan, where she practiced Hatch-Waxman litigation and also FDA regulatory law. And last but not least, we have Melissa Brand, who is Associate Counsel and Director of Intellectual Property Policy at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. She comes to us as a former patent litigator with Latham & Watkins and also Wilson Sonsini, and was previously a law clerk to Judge Kimberly A. Moore of the Federal Circuit. So we've got a panel of high-powered litigators and myself. So I'm going to let them do the arguing. But let's start off with a little opening statement from each of you. And what I'd like to ask of each of you is if you can make the case for how you think that patents interact with drug prices and healthcare, the topics that we have for conversation today. And in doing so, perhaps give a little background on your organization and where you guys are coming from. So let's just go straight down the line. So start with Tahir.
Thank you, Charles, and thanks to Anand and everyone at the Bipartisan Center for having me here. I think it's important, all the discussions we've had going on today and some of the work that we've been doing. I think one interesting statistic when we look at the exclusivities that come with patents, I almost said patent then, coming from England. But some of the studies that we've found is that since 2012, of the top 12 selling drugs on the market, of which 8 are biologics, we've seen price increases of 68%. But what we've also seen is as some of these, the main patents on these products start to come to expiry, we've seen a whole glut of new patents being filed in order to extend the exclusivity, and those prices are continuing to increase. So there does seem to be a relationship between companies trying to maintain their franchises on these products, whether it be through incremental innovations, as we've heard today, or whether it's strategic or defensive patenting in order to preserve the marketplace and keep competitors off. So I think there is definitely some relationship there that has been unpacked in many ways by many people, including the work that we've done. And I think it would be let's say, a misunderstanding to think that, oh, actually, this has got nothing to do with just patents and that we should keep these separate. I think there's definitely a relationship there. And I think we've seen that with all the various strategies that companies play. And I myself have played as a private practitioner on behalf of companies.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Hessler. I'm an Assistant General Counsel at the Association for Accessible Medicine. So that's the primary trade association for generic and biosimilar companies. And I just want to build on something Tahir just said. I think we, as sort of a trade association, we really do respect innovation. There are many good ideas out there. There are many good ideas very deserving of patents. I think something that's giving us increasing concern is just the sheer volume of patents and also sort of the lifespan of patents. So to take an example that some panelists mentioned earlier today, Humira, at the last time I looked at it, had something like 136 patents, and it may be more today. And I think the concern for us as prospective biosimilar manufacturers, we essentially, in baseball terms, have to bat 1,000 on those patents. We have to be able to have them, found not infringed or invalidated across the board. And I think that's just increasingly becoming just such a cost-intensive process to possibly litigate 100+ patents. It's just something that I think we view as virtually an impossibility. And so, again, we really do respect innovation. There's definitely good patents within the mix, but we're just concerned about what's increasingly becoming, especially in the biosimilar space, this enormous sort of barrier to entry where there's such a great volume of patents that it really becomes difficult to litigate all of those and deal with all of them.
Hi, I'm Melissa Brand with the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. We represent over 1,000 members, which are both companies, universities, research centers, nonprofits, both here in the US and abroad. The vast majority of our members are actually not big pharmaceutical companies, but actually small stage companies that are pre-revenue or have revenues under less than $25 million. I also will give the disclaimer, this is my second day back from maternity leave, so if what I say is completely incoherent, I apologize, and I'm sure my colleague in the back will let me know. I think, to me, when I thought about Charles's question, I thought, we in the US have a system where both for small and large molecule drugs, we make it a lot easier for somebody to copy an innovator product to bring it to market. They don't have to generate their own clinical data. I mean, there is more that is generated in the biosimilar space, but it still is an abbreviated route with the idea of getting these products to market at a discount, or in the case of small molecules, close to zero cost. And that's fine, and that's a policy decision that we've made in the US. But if you're an innovator and you're making a product that takes 10 years on average, once you get into clinical trials, and at least $1.5 billion on average out of pocket, so not talking about capitalized expenses, but out of pocket expenses, you'd be very hard pressed to justify doing those activities without getting some patent protection to procure some exclusivity for your innovations. So I think that's how patents get brought into the mix. I think our system has worked very well. We have great generic penetration in the US. We have some of the lowest prices in the civilized world for generic drugs. Biologics is a more recent innovation. They really only were able to really practically submit biosimilar applications in roughly 2015. The BPCIA didn't come into play until, I think, 2010. So it's a really new system that we're still working through. And I'll leave it at that, but one thing I just want to flag also, which I think people in the audience probably know, but the way patents are litigated in the small molecule space is significantly different from how they're litigated in the large molecule space. By statute, these litigations for biologics and biosimilars can begin 8 years before a biosimilar can even be introduced into the market by statute. So there's a window built in to sort through what patents might be relevant, because even if there is 136 patents on a product, and I don't know if there are or not, there is an 8-year period there to sort out which ones may or may not be relevant. But it's pretty clear that you probably don't have to practice all 136 of those patents to get your product on the market.
So we got a really great diversity of perspectives here. So let's talk about some of the issues. So we talked about a lot of them during the academic panel. So what I want to do is try to cover the waterfront and get in a couple of them that weren't quite discussed as much. Inter-parties review has been a major topic of conversation on the Hill and with the Patent Office. I know that all of the panelists have talked about this a lot. I guess, Karen, can I start with you to just give a background on kind of what's going on there, what inter-parties review is, and what the issue is there, and then I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel to kind of give their perspectives on it.
Sure. So the prior panels did an excellent job explaining sort of the basics of IPR. It's basically a more cost-effective, more timely process than district court litigation, as Melissa was mentioning. In the Hatch-Waxman space, district court litigation typically takes at least 30 months to judgment versus an IPR, which is about 18 months. So I think from my industry's perspective, IPR is an important tool to be able to get the Patent Office to take a second look at patents we think may be of questionable quality. I think there's been a lot of developments lately on IPR. There's been a piece of legislation that was recently heard in Congress, the Stronger Patents Act. And I think that piece of legislation, at least from our perspective, and others may have different perspectives here, we have general concerns that the Stronger Patents Act may in fact make IPR ultimately weaker. There's some provisions in the bill, for example, provisions that would impose an injunction as a matter of course after there's a finding of infringement and validity in a district court proceeding that would essentially overrule a Supreme Court case from a few years ago, eBay. And our general concern about that is that what are called mandatory injunctions are typically limited in the biologic space. There's a specific provision of when you can get a mandatory injunction. And from our perspective, that would sort of change the rules in place in biologics and allow companies that have historically licensed their patents, so have found monetary damages to be sufficient to potentially get an injunction on a patent that could be sort of, a smaller patent, for example, a manufacturing patent or something like that. There are other provisions in the bill, one of which is called one and done by some commentators, that essentially says if one party has an instituted inter partes review as to one claim, no one else can file an IPR. And the concern about that is that someone else in the world could have a dynamite piece of prior art that hasn't been looked at by the patent office and wouldn't be able to file an IPR in those circumstances. So I think we have some general concerns with that legislation in terms of we think IPR is a valuable tool for generics and biosimilars to try to sort of cut through these larger patent estates, and we don't want to see it substantially weakened.
And also, so what would your thoughts be in terms of the perspectives of the companies that you work with on enterprise review?
Yeah, so I guess one point is if biosimilars are so concerned about one particular manufacturing patent, that almost speaks to the great innovation of that patent, right? We hear a lot of the patents in the biologics space are manufacturing patents. So if they're really concerned about this one, it's probably very commercially valuable. It's probably truly innovative. So I don't know that that's something we want to discourage companies from innovating in. And I don't know that we have strong feelings about the injunction provisions, but we are strong supporters of the Stronger Patents Act. And the reason largely is because while IPR has a good purpose, and we supported the AIA, the way it has played out was unfair, largely, and through no intention of the courts or the PTO. But what we saw was that oftentimes it wasn't being used as this early challenge to try to clear a patent out of the way, especially in the small molecule space. What it was being used for was the second bite at the apple. So generics companies who have to file a paragraph 4 certification before litigation starts saying why patents are invalid would wait until almost a year until after the litigation had started to then file an IPR. That's the time frame. And what that does is it sets it up so that you get the PTAB decision right around the time that 30-month stay is ending. And therefore, you have both cases going up on appeal at the same time. So you're burdening the Federal Circuit, which is the court that hears these cases, and making them evaluate these appeals under different standards. So district court has a clear and convincing evidence standard. The PTAB by statute has preponderance of the evidence. For example, they have different ways they interpret the claims. That has changed since then, but by rule, not by statute. And so really the part of the Stronger Patents Act that really speaks to our members is resolving those distinctions, trying to level the field so you're not getting a different result depending on the agency you go to or which panel you get at the Federal Circuit, which appeal gets there faster. Because for us, these patents are not, there's something you need to be able to rely on, right? This is how we plan our business decisions. This is how we make our products and decide where to allocate resources. So if you have this pick a forum and see where the race goes fastest, that's a really difficult way and system in which to explain business decisions to your business makers.
Just before I get to here, Karen, do you have any thoughts in terms of the sort of forum issue?
Yeah, I think there have been some cases that have proceeded in multiple forms at once. One example is Zytiga, which is a drug that's used to treat prostate cancer. And I think earlier this year, the Federal Circuit affirmed a PTAB decision holding those patents invalid. And as a result of that, generics have been able to come on the market for that medication, which is a critical medication for prostate cancer, at, I think it's 81% below the brand price. So I think, the PTAB does provide an opportunity to have sort of a panel of technically skilled judges who are familiar with the area, look at this and make sure the patent office didn't have any issues when it initially granted the patent. So I think it's something where there continues to be value, and that was a case where there were multiple proceedings going in parallel at once, and I don't think there was any sort of necessarily, any attempt to game or anything like that, but it was something where a PTAB decision brought lower cost generics on the market and was affirmed by the Federal Circuit.
And then Tahir, so you've got some direct experience working in this space, both in the United States and around the world. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of your views on the merits of enterprise review and such procedures for public advocates like yourself?
Well, I think it's very important, particularly for public advocates and patient groups, because typically if you wanted to go to court, you don't have legal standing. So at least the IPR process provides some standing. It gives anybody can go there. Obviously, it's still prohibitive in terms of cost for many organizations to do so. Typically, it can run up to 250, 300,000 per petition, and that's on the cheap side. But a couple of things that came out from the discussion from my fellow panelists, one of the things that strikes me is the argument I hear a lot, and I was at an FTC panel last year, and this idea of certainty, and one of the issues that came out with the IPRs was the repeat filings or repeat petitions, which has largely been curbed now with some of the rules. And I find it's interesting to contrast that with how the patent system works in terms of continuations, because continuations also don't create certainty, and they're also a roadmap for patent applicants to work out the examiners. And so what happens is they will typically file an application, get a rejection. Okay, I've seen the prior art that the examiner has cited. I'll drop that application. I'll go and try again now, and I don't know what prior art is going to be cited. And that was the same allegation that was alleged towards repeat petitioners at the IPRs. So I think it's important to, if we want to play a fair game, it becomes a question of whose narrative is the strongest. And there's uncertainty on both sides. And so I think there's ultimately a favor to patent holders to uphold their interests. And as a result, we're giving more and more away, and we're not allowing at least more accountability from whether it be through the IPR process or whether it be through changing the actual way continuation systems work. I think these are all linked. To separate IPRs by themselves versus how patents are granted through the prosecution process, I think we have to look at the whole system. And often we isolate them, and then we don't understand how the game's played. So I'd like to make that point, first of all. And the second point, I think, something that Arti raised very clearly, and which is often not raised regarding biologics. I actually believe, and I know there's a history behind the AIA and why it never happened, and why it might not politically happen, but I think we need to expand the grounds of IPRs to written description rules. I think to the point made about having consistency within the Stronger Patent Act, well, if that's the case, let's have consistent grounds across all forums. Why can you only have grounds on 112 written description in court, but not through IPRs? If you want equality across the board, let's just bring it all together so that you can make these arguments. And I think there was a case recently where a pharmaceutical patent was found wanting on written description, and there was a Law 360 article saying, will pharmaceutical patent applicants have to rethink how they write their patents, and not so broadly? So that's an important aspect of IPRs, and if we're saying that biologics don't really describe what invention they're holding, are some of those patents suspect if we were really to apply a written description? So these are some of the things I think I'm just throwing out there, and I think a potential solution to some of the, how do you say, biases that each side has. And I think it's important to look at the larger context and rather than just isolating parts of the system.
Melissa or Karen, did you have any additional?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think there was also a recent PTAB decision where the PTAB suggested that the claims could not be construed during the IPR because they suffered from a problem called indefiniteness, which is basically saying the claims don't describe the invention with reasonable certainty. And the problem with that is that the PTAB can't reach an ultimate decision on indefiniteness and sort of have to punt the IPR as a result and say, it appears to be that there's an indefiniteness problem, but we ultimately can't reach that because it's outside of our statutory authority. So I think that's an interesting point in terms of the 112 issues, just because I know the indefiniteness issue in particular is something that's historically thought as almost a claim construction type issue, but can't be reached during an IPR.
So 112 issues can be addressed in the PTAB, both in PGR and through certain reexamination procedures. So I don't think that they necessarily need to come into IPR. I think IPR was intended to be a narrow procedure that deals with particular issues limited to printed publications. So, and we know that fact discovery can get more complicated at the PTO. I can't really speak to how they want to allocate their resources, but these are not full courts. So I think if people want to make a drug and they care about particular patents, they can use the PGR route. That is absolutely available to them, but it's limited in time. It's similar to, I think, the time frame that's used at the EPO, though I might be wrong on that, but I think it's similar. And then with respect to the continuation practice, I'll just flag that that practice applies in all technology areas. It's not something unique to the pharmaceutical space. Patents that issue as a result of a continuation expire at the same time as the parent application. And the scope of the invention is disclosed in that patent application that should publish 18 months after it's filed, regardless of whether it's in the first to issue patent or a later one. So the contours are set forth. There are practical reasons why you might want to have a narrower patent issue first, but that doesn't mean that you can claim a different invention that wasn't disclosed via a continuation application. So those are just some considerations to keep in mind.
And Tahir, I think you had a follow-up.
Well, it was actually the second part to your question about my global experience, so I only answered the first part. It's interesting because if you look at the EPO post-grant opposition proceedings in many other countries, they actually do have an extensive list of grounds that you can do these patent challenges on. And in fact, if we look at a case at the European Patent Office, or Patent Office, sorry, I slipped, against the hepatitis C drug Sovaldi. In Europe, the ground of written description, or sufficiency as we say over there, was actually found the patent wanting. And so 3 critical claims were removed or revoked. Whereas here, when we challenged those patents at the USPTO, we didn't have that ground to bring forward. We tried to make the point, but you just don't have a clear, distinct ground that you can make that argument. And that same argument also, and just irrespective of what your views are of certain jurisdictions, particularly because they're not from the developed world, but China also rejected that same patent on the same ground. Now, China has a very close relationship with the EPO in terms of examination, so you can disregard it if you don't think China has actually a stringent policy of examination, actually grants many patents. And this patent has been found in other countries as well, those claims. So I think written description is important. And I think just on the continuation point, it's important, in theory it sounds great, there's a time limit, you're not extending your exclusivity, but these are strategic games that get played. Continuations are filed as you watch your neighbors and your competitors, and you strategically tweak your patent applications. You keep it in the system as long as possible so that you can actually move according to how the field is moving. So I think it's not as benign as we think it is to think that the continuations are just limited and they just, narrow and so forth. They are actually tools that are used over a period of time. I mean, the same application can be lingering in the system for over 10 years, and just even as a deterrent by being on the books can actually delay and create uncertainty.
So shifting gears a little bit, we've talked about some of these different grounds for invalidity or requirements for patents. One of them that has come up quite often is Section 101, what's called patent subject matter eligibility. That's been a fairly substantial matter of debate. We've had a large number of hearings on that. Melissa, can you give a little background on what's going on there, kind of what's going on with the legislation, and what the issues are with regard to Section 101?
Sure. So Section 101 is part of the patent statute that governs what type of subject matter is eligible for patentability at all. So it's not traditionally thought of as whether something is new or obvious, but just the types of subject matter that can come in. So for example, you can't claim a data signal because it's not a process, a system, a composition of matter, so on and so forth. Starting around 2010 through about 2013, the Supreme Court issued a series of decisions that changed sort of how we think about patent-eligible subject matter. So it really resulted in a 2-part test called the Mayo-Alice test, where you basically look at a claim, you see what it's directed to. Is it an abstract idea like hedging, a natural phenomenon like how your body might metabolize something, and we can debate whether that's a natural phenomenon or not. But if you see that the claim is directed to that, then you look at what else is in the claim and you decide whether those remaining steps or elements embody something new and not routine or conventional to render the claim subject matter eligible. So the cases that are relevant to the biotech space that the Supreme Court dealt with, one was on gene patenting, and actually they didn't do this two-step test. It was a gene exists in nature, therefore you can't patent it. And then your reconstructed gene does not exist in nature, so you can patent it. That was the Myriad case. It's not really this two-step thing. The Mayo case had to deal with looking at metabolism of drugs that had been administered for a while, looking at the metabolites that had also been studied for a while, and then once you did that test, then decide what to do with the patient. It didn't give any concrete steps of what you should do then. So that was all fine and well, and you have other industries or sectors of the biotech industry, I should say, that really didn't think they would be implicated by either of these decisions. So think about antibiotic makers or other companies that extract compositions from nature, maybe peptide sequences that might have pain relief effects in humans. And suddenly their patents now are getting invalidated under this two-step test where they have nothing to do with gene patents and they have nothing to do with diagnostic testing, but now all of a sudden they can't get patents anymore. So this has been a problem for these, especially these small stage companies, right? So small stage biotech companies, they patent their early stage inventions, they sell them or partner with or get acquired by larger companies typically, and that's how you get this $1.5 billion and you get to market. But with this series of cases, it's basically, I think it's pretty well said by most stakeholders that it's very difficult now to predict what will happen to these type of inventions if you do patent them, whether a patent will hold up down the road. So Congress has been looking at reforming this section. There was a draft, it's not draft legislation, it's like draft principles of legislation that was introduced, I think, in May. And I guess we're waiting to see what happens with that. So.
Karen, can you give a perspective for how the generic and biosimilar industry is interested in this legislation and the doctrine in general?
Sure. So just to give a quick overview of the proposal that Melissa was talking about, there are a number of principles that are stated, one of which is there's historically been what are called these judicially created exceptions to patentability. So laws of nature, natural phenomenon, abstract ideas are generally not considered to be patentable. And I think the reasons for that, as the Supreme Court has explained, you're not sort of an inventor or discoverer of something that already exists in nature. And so one of the sort of principles of this proposal is that the case law relying on those judicial exceptions would be abrogated. And folks have later gone on to explain that doesn't necessarily mean we think the cases would reach a different result. It's just that these judicial exceptions would be abrogated. And I think part of our concern with that is these judicial exceptions have been in place for, I think it's 150 years. And if we're sort of starting from scratch and getting rid of those, we have concerns that that would sort of inject similar unpredictability into the system and make it so that patentability would now turn on a few additional principles that have been articulated. So whether or not the invention's in a technological field, whether or not it has what's called substantial and practical utility. And I think we have general concerns that both getting rid of the judicial exceptions and putting in some new tests would also lead to a lot of litigation of what the precise contours are of 101.
And do you see that as particularly affecting like generic entry or anything like that?
I think there are definitely some areas where 101 affects us. So Melissa talked about the Myriad case relating to isolated gene sequences that could potentially be relevant to the biosimilar space. Professor Carrier earlier talked about REMS, which is another area where we've seen some patenting on, for example, methods of correlating a patient and a prescription system. So that's another area where 101 has come up, and I think Professor Carrier has written quite a bit about that. So I think it does present the potential to have more patents that will have to be litigated under new standards under 101.
And then Melissa, can you flesh out kind of the sorts of technologies or technological areas that you think this 101 legislation might be affecting in terms of BIOS members?
Like I said, I think it really is more of these companies that are looking to acquire molecules from nature, for example, and then find out what effects they have in the human body. So antibiotics, for example, usually come from soil-dwelling bacteria, right? And they naturally produce these particular compounds, but hey, we need antibiotics, right? I think we all know antibiotic resistance is a huge problem. It's also a really hard business model, by the way, right? So think about it. It's a drug that's really hard to develop because it has to be molecularly very different from anything that's been developed in the past. Otherwise, it won't work. The resistance problem will be the same. And then once you go through this whole process of developing it and getting it approved, the goal is to sell as little of it as possible so that resistance doesn't spring up with respect to that drug. So how you justify investing money in that, it's a very complicated area. So that's an area where it's particularly prevalent. There are certain drugs, I think, where you look at, okay, perhaps it may be a cancer drug, and you need to know, okay, if you have this particular genetic mutation, this drug's not going to work for you. People with cancer probably want to be treated quickly with the best drug possible, least side effects. So if you can know what genetic mutations correlate to poor or better patient outcomes, that's very important. It's also very expensive work. It requires FDA approval to get that on your label. So I don't think we've gotten there. I think there is concern it could get there. And I think that would be very problematic because I think we all can agree we want people finding the best ways to treat our patients, especially terminally ill ones, as quickly as possible.
And Tahir, I'll give you the last word before we turn to audience questions.
So with Section 101, obviously, I'm looking more towards the sort of future, what's happening as we particularly get this term medtech, where everything's sort of converging, where we've got software, AI, drug discovery. How is that all going to work? I mean, typically software patents have been restricted. Are they going to open up again? Are we going to actually have more patenting in those areas as it relates to medical technologies? So these are some more policy concerns that I have that are not being thought out as we try to push through sort of broader patentability standards because industry demands it, and they say innovation is not going to happen. What are the public policy concerns of that? What are the ethical concerns of that? What's happening with data that goes into a lot of these things? I mean, we live in a data economy now, and sure, that's going to make its way into patents at some way, but we need to understand how that's going to work. And none of us have really thought about it, I think, in any deep way because we don't know what that future looks like. But before opening those doors, perhaps I think there needs to be consideration for public policy concerns, what those issues would be potentially look like and the scenarios that could play out.
All right, let's turn to the audience. If there are any questions, let the mic runners know.
Hi, Melissa Wasserman. So I just had a question on what's sort of driving a lot of the patenting in biologics that you're saying you get so many more patents for a biologic than a small molecule drug. Is it just science? Is it just because it's so much more scientifically difficult and there's so many different other things that you can patent? Or is there anything in the regulatory structure that as well? So I was just thinking about how they've delinked, right, FDA approval and biologics, like you don't have an orange book, right? And you have the patent dance, which you can largely just completely opt out of in the Federal Circuit case law.
I think it's partly science, as you mentioned. The size of these larger molecules, they're just much more complex than the small molecules that you synthesize in the laboratory, and they're grown in living organisms. So they're significantly more complex, which I think opens up a realm of additional patenting where you see a lot of method of manufacturing patents that are really prevalent in this space. I would also say you see a lot of patents that are molecule agnostic, so they're not specific to a given molecule. They're, for example, a method of purifying an antibody or something like that. And those are the patents that I think on some level give us concern. As Melissa mentioned, that there may be a significant subset of those patents that are perfectly valid. But I think our concern in the context of the patent dance is you can acquire patents on like a method of purifying an antibody from another company fairly late in the patent dance, and that would start sort of the second wave of litigation. And so there's just a potential for an acquisition of a significant number of patents in the context of the dance as well. But just to answer your question, I think it has to do a lot with the complexity of the molecules compared to small molecules.
I'll also just add to that. I think that there is a balance between getting your product approved as soon as is appropriate, right? You don't want to get it approved before it's not good to put into patients. But there's a lot of innovation that happens after that's important to patients. So for example, drugs that had to be infused before, now perhaps the patient can inject by themselves at home, and they can inject in a way that's actually a lot less painful because perhaps a buffer could be removed once they find out more about the stability after the product's been on the market. Also, over time, some of these older biologics, which, by the way, were approved before there was a BPCIA or even a biosimilar pathway, they find better ways to make them over time that makes the product more pure, more consistent, with less impurities in it. And these are injectable products by and large, and I think we can all agree we want the best products we're injecting into ourselves. Of course, they're safe when they are approved, but I think we can all agree it's important to have better products when that's appropriate. And if we don't want that, I mean, I think we should let people know, hey, we don't want more pure products out there. We're happy with the ones that are as are, and then that can be a different policy discussion.
Just one small point, and it's something that we're working through at the moment. I think one of the areas where they might see more patents in the biologic space is actually indications. I think if you look at, for example, Humira, and you look at the initial patents, and the initial patents disclose the potential indications, and then basically as they go through clinical trial and development, they just start picking them off. And Humira has about 10 indications. I think there aren't too many small molecules out there that actually have that many indications, although I think there's one coming down the road that's currently marketed that will probably hit similar number of indications as Humira. But I can't say anything yet. But I think that's one area where they do extract more out of the biologics.
But I will say to that too, also, biosimilars do not have to be approved with the same number of indications as the reference biologic product, and we see that quite a bit. And we also know induced infringement in the medical space is very difficult to establish. So that is true, and I think also I just will say that we want to encourage these companies to get these molecules that have been deemed safe and effective in the body, if they can treat other diseases rather than going back to square one with a new compound or molecule, I guess. That is valuable, right? It gets done quicker. More patients are treated, and by statute, the biosimilars don't have to get approved for the same indications.
I guess, Artie, I think you had your hand up for a while.
Just to follow up.
So we haven't really talked about this in this conference, but is the indication kind of additions also a consequence of the fact that you can't really skinny label in biologics, whereas you can, do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Skinny labeling. You can in small molecules, and so use patents are not really particularly useful in small molecules, whereas they can be in biologics.
Well, I think it's effectively skinny labeling, but because the biosimilars don't have to be approved for all of the same indications, that's, I think, effectively a skinny label. It's just a different route because of the way the statutes are set up, but yeah.
Yeah. So it's carving out certain indications that may be patented. So if the brand has, for example, patents on 3 indications, you might be able to carve out some of the other indications to be able to get a quicker approval. The one thing I'll mention about this is I think one broader concern we have just about carve-ins and carve-outs on labeling is its potential effect on uptake when the product does come to market. So if the product comes to market with only 1 indication out of 14, that may affect the ability to get it prescribed and for significant uptake. There's been some case studies with biosimilars, in particular one biosimilar on Remicade, which is now subject to an antitrust lawsuit in Pennsylvania, where there's just, I think a general theme is the difficulty in getting uptake for biosimilars.
I think we had a question in the back. Yeah.
Can you talk more about the way in which federal government in particular, but there may be other governments, state and local, that are involved, might benefit from patented product that's based on federally funded or government-funded research, so that the benefits accrue to the population at large, financial benefits accrue to the population at large, rather than exclusively to the companies that ultimately have the patent.
So when so assuming there's federal funding that goes to, say, a university, and it's typically called basic research when it's done at a university. It's not a hard and fast rule, but by and large, in this space, the licensable technology is basic research, meaning they might have identified a target or a mechanism of action, typically, but not exclusively, but typically they're not developing the molecule that will become the drug. But when those licenses are done, they're done like a commercial transaction, so royalties are paid back to the university, who then can do more research. But so once you get into clinical trials, right, it's on average 10 years to get a product to market. It's also true that 90% of drugs fail during that period of time. So that 90% rate of failure is taken on by a commercial entity, and that's a risky endeavor. Whereas I think that the policy has been generated that we don't want public funds necessarily failing 90% of the time, right? And that's why the risk is passed on to companies who can go out of business. And if they do succeed, well, then they're paying royalties back to the university. So I think that's how the policy works there.
Yeah, in the back.
Hi, Paul Heldman from Heldman Simpson Partners. Can you try to quantify the potential impact of legislation in Congress that would limit the number of patents that can be asserted? I mean, I think this legislation that got through the Senate Judiciary Committee would limit the number to 20. And to a guy who's not as much into this as you are, that still seems like a lot to me. So what does it really mean for the consumer if this legislation were to become law?
Right, so this is the Cornyn-Blumenthal legislation. Karen, I know that you've studied this somewhat, so.
Sure. So as Charles mentioned, this is S1416, which is the Cornyn-Blumenthal bill. And so essentially, as you've described, what it does is to impose a cap of 20 patents within the patent dance if certain events occur. One of those events has to be that there's full compliance with the steps of the patent dance, which, as one of the prior questioners mentioned, there's been a Supreme Court decision, Amgen versus Sandoz, where the Supreme Court said that you can sort of opt out of the patent dance. There are other preconditions as well to that imposition of the 20 patent cap. One of them is that there can't really be any dispute of a patent dance step called the provision of manufacturing information, which is one of the steps in the patent dance that occurs early and is frequently one that's subject to significant dispute. So I think part of our broader concern with the way this is sort of structured is there might be sort of avenues to avoid the patent cap. And I should also mention there are certain patents that would not be subject to it. So method of treatment patents are outside of the cap in the legislation. As we read it, device patents would also be outside of the cap. So I think, from our perspective as drafted, it may not sort of be a hard cap. There may be ways of potentially getting around it.
So do you have thoughts on?
Yeah, I think touching on the patent dance aspect of it, as I mentioned, I think in my opening statement, these biologics litigations can be brought 8 years in advance, roughly, of when the biosimilar could even be approved. And the point is to have the parties exchange information so that they can sort out what patents are relevant and what patents are not. Just because somebody has a patent doesn't mean that a biosimilar has to practice it. And so the idea of the legislation is to make that work better. We've seen so far in the small number of cases, and when the patent dance is followed, the number of patents that are asserted in litigation is lower, and that's because the parties are able to exchange the information and really sort out their issues and get this resolved in a timely manner. So I think that's really what it's going at. As I mentioned, method of treatment patents are difficult to enforce, and that's up to the biosimilar if they want to seek those indications. So I think it's a bipartisan bill. I think that's important to note. And I think the idea is really just to let the BPCIA work, as it's a new system largely. And so I think it will be a positive step.
All right, so it seems that we're up to our time. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you for listening.
Well, that concludes our morning program today. I want to just reiterate my thanks to all of the panelists and the experts, starting with the commissioner. And Marcus, thank you for staying for the duration of the event. All of our academic experts, stakeholder panelists, or moderators. Terrific questions. Thank you to the audience and everyone joining us via webcast. I want to thank our team here at BPC, Natalie Ham, Collier Fernikes. Also want to thank BPC Senior Fellow Ovik Roy. I think a lot of information today, hopefully very helpful and informative to all of you. I think us at BPC, we're going to continue to track both legislative as well as executive branch activity in this area. I think we're all pro-competition, pro-innovation, as well as we want to ensure the affordability of medicine. So we look forward to continuing the conversation and want to thank all of you for being here today. Thank you, everybody.